He didn't expect her to react. He expected her to flinch, to freeze, to fold. But in front of 310 soldiers, she didn't step back. She stepped through and made a general hit the ground harder than any war had ever done before. You're watching the Storyscape, where quiet heroes don't ask for power, they earn it. True strength isn't about volume. It's about what you do when no one else dares to move. Subscribe for more untold stories of honor, courage, and the unexpected faces of leadership. Fort Covenant wasn't like most bases. It didn't breathe with discipline, it exhaled dominance. Perched in the barren edge of the Nevada desert, it had a reputation that stretched further than any official record, a place where war-hardened men ran the show and where protocol often bowed to power. General Marcus Halstead had ruled the base for nearly a decade, decorated, feared, untouched. He believed in control, tradition, and command that didn't require questioning, only obedience. Some called him a relic of another era. Others called him exactly what the military still rewarded behind closed doors, a lion who didn't tolerate challenge. But then came her. She stepped off the C-130 in standard-issue boots, olive fatigues, and no visible emotion. Major Arielle Dawson, newly transferred from a classified operations wing, orders stamped directly from the Pentagon. To the outside eye, she looked unassuming, calm, even understated. But for those with eyes trained to see the truth, they noticed the way the crew chief saluted her without even looking at her rank. They noticed how she carried her own duffel, even though protocol said someone else should. And most of all, they noticed her eyes, focused, still, and old, in a way that had nothing to do with age. She wasn't there for reassignment. She wasn't there for observation. She had been sent. Her file was classified, mostly redacted lines and quiet commendations, but word spread fast. 3 tours, 2 Black Ops citations, 1 disappearance from the record books that no one dared to ask about. Halstead didn't like ghosts in his house, and Arielle Dawson was a ghost wrapped in rank. Her arrival wasn't announced over loudspeakers or paraded with brass. It was quiet, intentional. By sundown, she was already reviewing logistical inconsistencies in the motor pool. By the end of the week, 2 training drills had been recalibrated based on her recommendations, and by the start of the second, whispers began. She didn't salute him back.
She made the recon team rerun the entire op layout, and they agreed. General Halstead skipped her in the morning brief. She didn't flinch. She wasn't there to be liked, and she wasn't there to play safe. But no one had seen her cross the line yet. The first time Halstead met her was in the Situation Room. 10 officers in full uniform, steel silence, and wall-sized maps. She entered late, but not out of carelessness. She had been reviewing the live drone feed before the meeting even started. Halstead didn't rise, didn't smile, just narrowed his eyes and said, "Major Dawson, hope the desert heat doesn't slow down your kind of thinking." A pause. "I operate at any temperature, sir," she replied calmly, taking her seat. The room went stiff, not because of her tone, but because she hadn't blinked. Halstead's smirk cracked slightly, but he moved on. Everyone in the room understood what had just happened. He tested her. She didn't just pass. She marked her line. Behind closed doors, the game began. Her submitted reports were held back for review. Her requisition forms were returned with red-inked corrections.
She was reassigned from strategic planning to unit observation, a silent demotion on paper. But she didn't push back. She watched. She took note of every command that bypassed protocol, every recruit reassigned without reason, every young officer who spoke up once, then disappeared into rotation. And she began speaking to soldiers, not loudly, not formally, just small words in the hallway, calm corrections in the yard, quiet feedback during drills. At first, they responded with caution, then attention, then respect, because they realized something that command had missed. She wasn't there to climb, she was there to clean, and in Fort Covenant, that meant trouble. 2 weeks in, a folded note appeared on her bunk. Plain paper, no signature. He's watching you, not to evaluate, to remove. That night, she didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, because she remembered. She'd seen men like Halstead, ranked, respected, rotten inside, and she knew how far they were willing to go to protect their illusion of control. She wasn't going to flinch. She'd been taught a long time ago, if someone lifts a hand against you in front of others, you don't just stop the strike, you end the silence. And somewhere in her gut, she felt it. That moment was coming, and when it did, she'd be ready. Because Fort Covenant hadn't met someone like her yet, but they were about to. By the 3rd week of Major Arielle Dawson's posting at Fort Covenant, the silence had grown sharper.
It wasn't the kind that followed orders. It was the kind that followed suspicion. The shift was subtle at first. Morning briefings were shuffled at the last minute, usually excluding her. Tactical meetings that once required her input now went ahead without notice. Supply forms submitted through proper channels were lost, then mysteriously rerouted with signatures she never authorized. No one said it outright, but the intent was clear. Isolate her, undermine her, and hope she'd either lash out or fade out. But she did neither. Instead, Arielle responded with precision. She began keeping 2 copies of every document she submitted. She started logging timestamps on briefings, photographing altered orders, even tracking the training efficiency of her squad compared to others on the base. She didn't raise her voice, didn't file complaints. She documented. She observed. She adapted. Because Fort Covenant didn't run on discipline, it ran on dominance, and she knew the difference. The soldiers under her supervision began to notice too. When she spoke, it was never performative. She corrected form without shouting, explained tactical adjustments without ego, and most importantly, stood shoulder to shoulder during live drills rather than barking commands from a safe distance. They started calling her ma'am, not because they had to, but because they meant it. Staff Sergeant Nolan, a quiet, respected non-com with 18 years in, once approached her after a brutal ruck march and said only 4 words. "We see what's happening." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. It was enough to know she wasn't alone in the watching. But General Halstead did not like being watched, and he certainly didn't like being outmaneuvered. So, he shifted strategy. His jabs became quieter, but more strategic. He reassigned one of her top corporals without notice. He replaced her driver with a junior recruit who accidentally missed 2 meetings. He initiated an unannounced inspection on her unit, citing disciplinary inconsistencies even though her squad had outperformed every other team in the past month. But no fault was found because there wasn't any. Still, Halstead didn't need faults. He needed pressure, and Arielle felt it mounting. Then came the rumors. Not about her performance, but about her past. Whispers that she had been pulled from her last assignment for emotional instability, that her commendations were politically motivated, that she was under special observation from the Pentagon. Soldiers began to glance sideways in the mess hall.
A few stopped speaking when she entered the room. These weren't rumors started by accident. They were seeded, intentional, strategic, and she recognized the pattern instantly. It was character erosion, not by attack, but by suggestion. But Arielle didn't falter. She'd been trained for warfare, both physical and psychological, and this was just another front. Then, one evening, after a 14-hour field drill under punishing sun, she returned to her quarters to find her locker ajar. Inside, nothing was missing, but on the bench lay a single object, her old unit insignia, one that no one on base should have had access to. It had been bent in half. Underneath it, a note. Careful who you think you're better than. No signature, no fingerprints. Just a reminder that someone was watching her back, but not to protect it. She reported nothing. She logged everything. And the next morning, she showed up to the drill yard before sunrise, leading her squad through a grueling tactical run with full gear. When they crossed the final checkpoint, she didn't stop. She ran the last lap alone with the entire unit watching, not because it was protocol, but because it sent a message. She wasn't tired, she wasn't cornered, and she damn sure wasn't done. Staff Sergeant Nolan approached her after that drill and stood silently for a moment before saying, "They're not used to leaders running at the front." She looked at him and replied, "Then they'd better get used to it." Later that week, Halstead called a base-wide live maneuver, a full combat simulation with all active personnel present. It was rare and highly formal, usually reserved for visiting officials or regional commanders, but this one had no outside observers, just 310 soldiers and Halstead himself watching from the command tower. The simulation was sharp, intense, and borderline dangerous. It involved coordinated flanks, shifting terrain, smoke grenades, and timed breaching. Every officer had a role, every unit a zone, and Arielle's team, despite all interference, executed with near-perfect discipline. But midway through the exercise, she noticed something off. A weak point on the left side of the formation, a gap opening too wide, too fast. It wasn't her zone, but if left unchecked, it would cause a simulated wipe of an entire unit. She gave the order. Precise, direct, field authorized. Her team repositioned. They closed the flank, neutralized the breach, and held formation. From a tactical standpoint, it was flawless. From a political one, it was a fuse. Because Halstead had been watching, and that single call, made with clarity and success, was all he needed to stage what came next. As the last smoke grenade cleared and soldiers regrouped in formation, Arielle stood at the perimeter, speaking briefly to her squad. A shadow moved behind her. Then the intercom cracked. Halstead's voice, low and sharp, echoed across the field. "Major Dawson, who authorized that repositioning?" She turned, calm, even, but her posture tightened. "I did, sir." There was a pause, a long one, and then he stepped down from the tower, boots heavy against steel, eyes fixed on her like a laser. The entire yard fell quiet. Soldiers turned, whispers died mid-air. Helmets tilted, all eyes locked. Arielle didn't move, didn't blink. She stood straight, waiting. Halstead crossed the field slowly, deliberately, until he stood inches from her. "You don't make decisions on my field," he said low, jaw tight. "With respect, sir," she answered evenly. "My decision prevented a breach and preserved simulation integrity." His eyes narrowed. "You think you're in control here?" he asked. She didn't answer. And that's when it happened. His hand rose, not fast, not yet striking, but clearly raised. A collective breath caught in the air. 310 soldiers, absolute silence. No one moved. But she did. And in the next part, the silence will finally break. The air on the drill field turned solid, like heat pressing against glass. No one moved. Not the squad leaders in formation, not the new recruits frozen mid-step, not even the camera crew assigned to document the maneuver for internal training archives. All eyes were fixed on the center of the yard, on the general with his hand raised, and the woman who didn't back down. Arielle Dawson stood motionless, her boots anchored in the dirt, her spine aligned like a drawn blade. She didn't flinch, didn't raise her arms, didn't retreat. She wanted every soldier there to witness what was about to happen with no ambiguity. She hadn't provoked this. She hadn't escalated. But if the general wanted to cross the line in front of 310 witnesses, she'd make sure he did so without the protection of shadows. Halstead's hand paused for just half a second. Hesitation? Calculation? It didn't matter. That slight delay was all Arielle needed to confirm what she'd already seen in his eyes. He wasn't just posturing. He was going to strike. And that was his final mistake. The instant his shoulder flexed forward, Arielle moved. Not reactively, not emotionally, but with the trained precision of someone who had been in close-quarters combat more times than she could count.
She stepped into his space, not away from it, but intercepted his wrist before the strike could connect. Her grip was firm, mechanical, exact. In a single pivot, she redirected his momentum, twisted under his extended arm, and executed a textbook hip throw designed not to wound, but to drop a man hard enough to end the fight. The sound of his body hitting the dirt cracked across the yard like a rifle shot. The shock wasn't just in the sound, it was in the visual. A four-star general, sprawled in the dirt, his dominant arm locked and neutralized, face flushed with a mix of rage and disbelief. He tried to speak, but the wind had been knocked out of him, and his jaw couldn't decide between a command and a growl. Arielle released the hold the moment his back hit the ground. She stepped back with absolute composure, breathing steady, posture unshaken. She didn't gloat, she didn't speak. She simply stood there as silence collapsed into murmurs, then gasps, then hushed chaos. One of the junior medics broke formation and sprinted toward the fallen general. Behind him, a camera drone hovered, red light blinking silently as it captured every angle. A sergeant whispered to a lieutenant, "Is this real?" Another recruit near the back just muttered, "She dropped him. She really dropped him." Within seconds, the yard was in controlled disarray. Officers scrambled to restore order. Field commanders barked for medics and for cameras to be turned off. Too late. The footage had already been recorded from 3 angles. The strike, the counter, the fall, all preserved in crystal clarity. General Halstead refused to be helped up. He stood on his own after 2 failed attempts, brushing off the medic, his face red with fury and humiliation. He didn't look at Arielle. He couldn't. He simply turned and walked off the field, his gait stiff, his pride fractured beyond repair. Arielle remained in place, not in defiance, but in duty. Her squad stood behind her, formation still intact. Sergeant Nolan stepped forward slightly, saying nothing, but the message was clear. She wasn't alone. Major Daniels, the senior intelligence officer who just arrived at Fort Covenant that morning for an inspection visit, had watched the entire scene unfold from the review platform. She leaned over to her aide and said, "Mark the time. This base just changed." That afternoon, the field was cleared, training suspended, troops dismissed early, though few actually left the barracks or mess hall.
Conversations pulsed like aftershocks through every corridor. She didn't even flinch. His hand was up.
It wasn't a misunderstanding. She waited. She made sure we all saw it. What happens now? Back in her quarters, Arielle sat quietly, her boots still on. Her uniform dusted from the throw, her wrist slightly bruised from the impact, but her breath calm. She stared at her hands, the same hands that had stabilized downed pilots, disarmed insurgents, held pressure on wounds, and now stopped a general from crossing a line in front of 310 soldiers. There was a knock at her door. Sergeant Nolan entered without waiting for permission. He looked down, then back up at her, voice low but resolute. "No one thinks you are wrong." She nodded once. "Doesn't mean they'll say it out loud." "They will now," he replied. Outside her room, the wind carried the sound of boots marching, but not in drill cadence. These steps were different, lighter, more deliberate. Word was already spreading, not just that she'd dropped a general, but that she'd done it with control, restraint, and the full weight of military doctrine on her side. In that moment, Arielle knew something deep in her gut. Halstead wouldn't go quietly. But he also wouldn't walk back what had just happened, because too many had seen it. And more importantly, too many had felt it. She hadn't just defended herself. She had punctured the illusion of untouchable power, and the ripple effect was only beginning. The next morning, Fort Covenant woke up changed. There were no alarms, no drills, no emergency communiques, but the silence felt loaded, as if the entire base was holding its breath. The air was sharper, conversations quieter. Soldiers walked with their heads on a swivel, not out of fear of conflict, but awareness. Something irreversible had happened on that parade ground. A boundary that had always been whispered about, feared, obeyed, had been shattered in full view, and no one could pretend it hadn't. General Halstead didn't report to his office. His vehicle remained parked outside command, but he was nowhere in sight. His aides answered no questions, avoided eye contact, and moved with the unease of men orbiting a fallen star. Rumors poured through every corner of the base like smoke through air vents. Some said his wrist had fractured. Others claimed it was his ego. Most didn't care about the details. They cared about the image. A general on the ground, dust on his ribbons, dropped not by an enemy, but by a major who never raised her voice. Arielle Dawson was placed on immediate administrative reassignment, pending inquiry. The order was delivered by a stone-faced operations officer who avoided saying the words "suspended." They didn't handcuff her. They didn't interrogate her. They simply moved her into a sterile room in the operations annex and told her to wait. She did, calmly, without protest, because Arielle knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was only the threshold. Outside her temporary quarters, soldiers still passed by, some too nervous to look her way, others glancing just long enough to offer the smallest nod. Sergeant Nolan dropped off a black coffee in a plain cup. No words, just a tap of his knuckles on the table before he left. It was enough. That afternoon, a military investigator arrived, Colonel Devin Sharp, Internal Affairs, Pentagon Orders. He entered with a leather-bound folder under one arm and a body language that said he already had opinions. He asked her to sit. She did. He asked her to recount the events. She did, with the same composure she'd shown on the field. He didn't interrupt, but he didn't nod either. When she finished,
He opened the folder and revealed 3 printed still frames taken from drone footage. In each one, Halstead's hand was visibly raised. In the final frame, her intercept and takedown were frozen in perfect clarity. Colonel Sharp leaned back and said, "The footage matches your statement. The question is no longer whether you did it, it's why." She replied, "Because he was about to cross a line that should never be crossed, especially in uniform." He didn't write anything down, just studied her for a moment longer and said, "You know what this means, don't you?" She nodded. "It means the illusion is broken." He didn't disagree. By evening, whispers had turned into small declarations. A young female lieutenant submitted an incident report from 3 months earlier, previously ignored. A non-commissioned officer confessed that he'd witnessed Halstead dress down 2 soldiers for speaking to Arielle outside the mess. Quietly, a list began to form. Statements, testimonies, years of patterns. Halstead remained silent. His legal team, flown in from out of state, issued a terse release. "My client was physically assaulted during a routine command exercise. We expect disciplinary action consistent with protocol." But that argument didn't hold. Not anymore. Not with video evidence, not with statements mounting, not when 310 soldiers had watched the moment unfold in real time. The Pentagon wasn't blind. By the end of the second day, oversight officers from Regional Command arrived on base. No press was allowed, but that didn't stop the story. Internal message boards across military networks began lighting up.
She stood her ground. She stopped the strike. The general fell. We all saw it. Within 48 hours, Arielle's name was on the lips of people she'd never met. Officers from other bases, retired service members, quiet allies. Some were angry, others grateful, most inspired. For years, soldiers had whispered about the moments when the chain of command turned into a cage, when authority protected itself at the cost of those beneath it. But no one had ever stopped it mid-motion. Not like this. Not in public. Not with restraint. Not without fear. General Halstead's reputation began to unravel, not with a bang, but with a cascade. Files that had been sealed suddenly requested, archived complaints dug up, a personnel record from a decade ago that hinted at command climate issues. A captain from Fort Mason who retired early now requesting to reopen her case. Meanwhile, Arielle remained quiet. She wasn't on social media, she didn't give statements, she didn't dramatize the event. She just waited, reviewed training data, took notes, and stayed ready. Because she understood something many didn't. The real fallout wouldn't come from the strike. It would come from the response, from the institutional discomfort that followed it. And the question hanging over every corridor of Fort Covenant wasn't, did she overreact? It was, how did this go unchecked for so long? In her 3rd day of reassignment, she received a message. Plain envelope. No return. Inside, a single line, typed. You didn't just stop him. You showed us how. No name, no unit, no request. Just truth. That evening, she sat alone in her quarters, staring at the wall-mounted map of Fort Covenant. The parade field, the tower, the barracks, the drill yards. She traced a line across it with her finger, starting from the far end of the simulation zone, through the center of the yard,
and ending where Halstead had fallen. A moment mapped like a turning point. Because it was. And the military didn't know it yet, but Arielle Dawson wasn't a problem to contain. She was a mirror, and it was time they looked. By the 5th day after the incident, Fort Covenant no longer felt like a military base. It felt like a fault line. Conversations shifted depending on who walked into the room. Ranks no longer guaranteed silence. Loyalty was no longer measured in obedience. The act of standing near Arielle Dawson, even in passing, was no longer neutral. It was a statement. The inquiry was escalated. What began as an internal disciplinary review had transformed into a full-fledged military investigation sanctioned by the Department of the Army.
Not just into the incident between General Halstead and Major Dawson, but into the climate of the entire base. And that climate, once armored by years of intimidation and silence, was beginning to crack open. Colonel Devin Sharp returned with 2 JAG officers and an aide carrying sealed files. They set up a secure conference room in the base's administrative wing and began interviews, formal ones. Every soldier who had been present during the simulation drill was required to submit a statement. Most complied. Some asked for confidentiality. A few, surprisingly, asked to speak on record. By the end of the first day, over 70 individual accounts had been logged. The patterns were unmistakable. Halstead had a history, one that had never been written down in official reprimands, but had lived in the barracks and briefings, the reassignments and disappearances. He berated young officers during group meetings, publicly humiliated female soldiers under the guise of discipline. He had denied leave requests, blocked promotions, and reassigned anyone who questioned his commands, even when their objections were rooted in protocol. Until now, no one had connected the threads, or at least no one had dared to. Arielle watched it all unfold from a distance. She was not allowed to participate in regular operations, but she was not under arrest. In fact, every day she was greeted by small signs that something much larger had begun. A staff sergeant nodded to her with a slight bow. A junior officer left a copy of the Uniform Code of Military Justice at her door, with 2 pages marked in yellow. Even the base chaplain stopped by her room, not to offer comfort, but to say, "You did what most of us only rehearsed in our heads." The footage from the drill was now in the hands of the Pentagon. 3 angles, 1 raised hand, 1 fluid counter, and a general flat on his back. The visuals spoke for themselves. What they didn't show, but what every soldier confirmed, was the look on Halstead's face before he moved. Rage, entitlement, and the full expectation of compliance. And the stillness in Arielle's eyes that said, "Not today." By the end of the week, the dam truly broke. A second wave of statements came in, unsolicited, unprovoked, and more powerful than the first. These weren't just from soldiers at Fort Covenant. They came from Fort Mason, Fort Allen, Camp Preston, bases where Halstead had served in the last 15 years. Former subordinates, retired officers, even 2 civilian contractors.
One email, read aloud during a closed session of the inquiry board, simply said, "We always knew someone would stop him. We just didn't expect it to be in front of everyone." The Army couldn't contain the story. It wasn't a PR problem anymore. It was a cultural one. And the footage had leaked. No one knew how. But by the time a legal injunction was requested, it was too late. The clip had appeared on a closed veterans forum, then Reddit, then a military subreddit, and finally, news outlets. The view count exploded overnight. Within 24 hours, the headlines rolled in. Major drops general in live drill. Pentagon orders full review. Footage confirms raised hand. Army investigates toxic command culture. She didn't flinch. Major Dawson becomes symbol of institutional reckoning. The Army issued a brief statement. We are conducting a thorough review of all relevant facts. The U.S. military is committed to upholding the highest standards of leadership and accountability. It said a lot. It meant very little. Because the story had already taken on its own life. Back on base, the lines were becoming visible. Some officers, particularly those with years under Halstead's command, avoided Arielle altogether. They kept their posture tight, their eyes forward, their faces unreadable. Others moved differently. They stood taller. They spoke more freely. One junior logistics officer submitted a 2-page complaint about her previous supervisor, something she'd been too afraid to write before. And then came the call. Arielle was summoned to Washington, D.C., not under arrest, not under suspicion, but under formal request. She was to testify in a preliminary Article 32 hearing regarding General Halstead's conduct. Her escort, a quiet major with an envelope in hand, offered her no commentary, just the paper and a plane ticket. She took it without hesitation. As she packed her gear, she received a knock at her door. It was Sergeant Nolan. No words, just a handshake. His palm lingered slightly, then released. "We'll be watching," he said. "Not for the fallout, but for the shift." She nodded. It's already started. When she arrived in D.C., the shift was even clearer. Uniformed officials in the terminal nodded subtly. A civilian in a business suit mouthed "thank you" from across the hall. Her name was on briefing documents. Her image, blurred from drone footage, had been on national television. She had become something she never asked to be. A symbol, but not of resistance, of refusal. She hadn't struck to inspire. She hadn't thrown to make a point.
She had stopped a moment that should have never started, and in doing so, she'd shown others exactly what that moment looked like and what to do when it came. Inside the hearing room, she stood straight as the officers entered. The judge advocate didn't ask her to recount the whole incident. He simply played the footage. The room watched in complete silence. When it ended, he asked her only one question. "Major Dawson, why didn't you step back?" Her answer was immediate. "Because I've spent too much of my career watching others step aside. And because if I had stepped back, every soldier watching would have learned that it's acceptable to be struck down if the one striking you outranks you. I won't teach that lesson." The panel didn't interrupt. They didn't debate. They just listened. Because they knew. What she said was not just a justification, it was a doctrine. The hearing would continue. Charges would mount. Policies would be reviewed. But the reckoning had already happened. It had happened the moment a general raised his hand and a woman didn't move. 2 weeks later, Fort Covenant stood beneath a different sky. The desert sun still beat down on the tarmac. The wind still carried sand through the barracks courtyards. But something in the air had shifted. Less rigid, less sharp. Soldiers walked straighter, but not from fear. Officers spoke clearer, but not louder. There was no parade, no ceremony, and yet everyone knew something old had ended, and something new had begun. General Marcus Halstead was gone.
The Article 32 hearing had concluded with a resounding recommendation: dishonorable discharge, immediate demotion, and referral to civilian court on charges of attempted assault, obstruction of justice, and long-standing command abuse. The Pentagon, under rising public pressure and congressional attention, followed through. The decision was unanimous. The footage alone had made it irreversible. The 310 witness statements had made it inarguable. But it was Major Dawson's testimony that made it unforgettable. She didn't weep. She didn't condemn. She spoke of duty, restraint, and the silent weight of leadership, of the difference between command and control, of the responsibility that came with rank, and the courage that was required to stop those who misused it. Her words, simple and precise, had landed not like accusations, but like a map, a way forward, and the room had listened. Upon returning to base, she wasn't welcomed with fanfare. She didn't want that. But when she stepped off the transport, every soldier present turned toward her without being asked.
One by one, they raised their hands, not in salute, but in something more honest, a gesture of quiet allegiance, of recognition, of understanding that rank meant nothing without integrity behind it. General Halstead's name was being removed from plaques, drill manuals, internal documents. But Arielle Dawson's name had spread beyond Fort Covenant, beyond Nevada, beyond even the military. By the third week, she was summoned to Regional Command Headquarters, not for reprimand, for a new assignment. She was to co-lead a special military ethics task force charged with rewriting protocol for internal officer accountability. It sounded procedural, but it was seismic. For the first time in decades, the doctrine would be examined by someone who hadn't just read the rules, but who had stood inside them when they failed. She accepted, with one condition, that her base team be given autonomy to review field behavior, not just paperwork. They agreed. Before she left Fort Covenant, she walked the length of the drill yard alone, the same space where the moment had unfolded. She stopped where Halstead had stood, where his hand had risen, where the silence had cracked. She bent down, brushed dust from the stone edge of the field, and stood again. There was no plaque, no marker, just the echo of a choice. She turned, and standing at attention across the field was Sergeant Nolan, flanked by a dozen recruits, some of whom had been there that day. One of them, a young woman with a nervous smile and a bright new stripe on her sleeve, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said. "We watched. We learned." Arielle gave a nod. "Then you're ready." That night, she packed her things, one duffel, one uniform, one copy of the UCMJ with margin notes in her own handwriting. At the bottom of her bag was a folded piece of paper she'd carried since that morning, a hand-drawn sketch slipped under her door. It showed a silhouette of a woman standing tall, one hand raised, not in defense, not in violence, but as a shield. Behind her, the blurred outline of soldiers standing straighter. Scrawled beneath it in ink, "Respect is what remains when the shouting ends." She pinned the sketch to the back of her locker, left it there, a marker not of victory, but of turning. As the base lights dimmed and the desert cooled, Major Arielle Dawson stepped into a military vehicle bound for her next station. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't have to. The ground behind her no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to all who saw what was possible when one person stood up and when power, unearned, fell.